Hey there, folks. In the last tutorial, we added some UI enhancements to our auth.view component and its login child form or login form child that you see here to show some loading state and display some possible API errors at the bottom of this card. Towards the end, we also added functionality in our useAuth hook to push the user to the login screen if they are not authenticated, and to push them back to home or the details page when they are successfully authenticated. So right now we're actually at our authenticate component, but if we try to go to the home route, what you should see is that we are pushed to the authenticate route. Also notice that I've opened up our application tab of our developer tools and gone to local storage for this domain, and you can see that there are no keys. I now want to log in with my bob@bob.com with a password of password. And when I log in, what you'll see is we will be pushed to the root account page, meaning malcorp test/account. And then you should see 2 tokens stored here in local storage. There we go. And we get an ID token, which is a token that's used as an access token to access various APIs. And you get a refresh token, which is longer lived and can be used to get a new ID access token. Now, the details of why we do this are covered in the API section, but if you're interested, I will include in the video description my argument for why I am okay using these tokens inside of local storage, as there is some vigorous debate out there about why these might need to be used in like a secure HTTP cookie. But again, I'll leave you some links to some good articles, and you may still disagree with me. That's fine, but I hope you'll find them interesting. Now, what I want to do today in this app is work on logic that will make a check for an authorized user on the initial page load. In other words, on initial page load, we'll check this ID or access token, we'll parse it to get its actual payload, and then we'll set the user in our auth state, which we created in the last 2 videos. And then I'll also use this refresh token to silently get a new ID token after the user is loaded. And so this will hopefully seamlessly happen in the background, and then the user will be authorized to make requests with an up-to-date ID token that's valid for a new 15-minute period. And just as a review of how our API works, is when a user authenticates, meaning they sign in with a valid email and password, they will get a token pair with an ID token and refresh token as data in JSON. And the ID token is only valid for 15 minutes. So if this ID token is expired, any client application, notice this says client applications, can request a refresh token or can request a pair of tokens with the refresh token. So they'll send this refresh token, which is valid for 3 days, and our ID token is valid for 15 minutes, I believe. And they send this refresh token, and they will get a fresh set of tokens. But to access various applications and services in the application, or in the domain or our company, the user can use the ID token, which is short-lived. So that's what this is showing, is the ID token is sent in the header payload, and we could access various apps. The goal of this project is to create a word memorization app. To get started, I want to open up our project, which is running here. I now want to refactor the Auth Store that we worked on in the last couple of tutorials. That is in the source folder and under auth.js. I also want to open our main file here to go over some things. So if we look at this file, we can see that we use the vue-router at the application root and not just in the top level app component. So I'm referring to app.vue. So there's a difference, for example, of providing the vue-router inside of the setup method of an app component versus the app created from create app. I know that's confusing because this component is called app, but the actual app that's created is this app as you can see, which is returned from the createApp function. I would like to be able to use our Auth Store in the same way that we're using router, so that even our app.view component already has the store provided. So instead of providing it here, basically, I want to provide it at this root level when we create the app. Now, there's a couple ways we could do it. We could actually use a .provide here. And then remember in our auth.js last time, we created this sort of provide auth function, which provides a store symbol and then the auth store. So we could actually export this store symbol. Where is it? It's actually just right here. And then we could also export the auth store, and then we could just provide those in this function. However, I want to show you how you can use or create a plugin with our auth store so that we can also use a syntax similar to .use, just like we do for the router. Now, why can this router be used as a plugin? If we actually go to the routes, let's see, routes.js here, that's where we create the router. So let's just actually control click here. You'll see that we define some routes in an array, and then we use this create router function, and that actually returns something of type router. And this router actually is an object which contains something called an install method. If we go to the view docs for plugins, I have it open right here. You can see that for something to be a plugin, it basically needs to be an object with an install key or a field, and this field contains a function which receives the app. And what is this app? Well, it's just the app from this create app here that's returned. And so we can chain on a .use, and it will get access to the app created by this function. And then it can also receive extra configuration options, which we will not be using. So what we're going to do now is to create something, a function similar to create router, but for our auth store. So let's go back to not main.js. I guess I unopened it, to this auth.js file in the store folder. And let's create ourselves a create auth store function. And let's go and create this. How about we do it just below where we're signing up and signing in? All right. And then I also can probably get rid of this auth store because you can see we're going to create it in this function. And let's save this, and I will scroll back up. And you can see that this create auth store is going to receive options. Now, last time we added options into our actual use auth hook or composable. This is the view world. And then we kind of configured what routes we'll push to if the user is not authenticated and then they become authenticated, meaning that our store will have a current user. Then we'll push them to an unauthenticated route, meaning like the home page in this case. And if there was a user and then we get no user, meaning there's a change to no user, then we'll push them to the authenticate page, which is this require auth route. But instead of doing this by passing the use auth config here, I want to actually set this up inside of our create auth store. So this option, the unauthenticated route and the require auth route, will now be passed into this create auth store. And we have this little or here that creates an empty object in the case that we don't pass any options, just so that this top level object is not undefined. We can handle undefined for these two parameters later on. The next thing we do is create the auth store, which is basically the same thing that we had before. If we scroll down, actually I just deleted it, but it basically takes a spread refs version of the state, which is just the current user, token, loading, and error state, the methods we created for signing up and signing in, and then now we will pass to this store the onAuth route, which will be passed from this configuration, and the require auth route. So now we're actually not going to need this provide auth, though it still could be useful in some cases. Also, I'm going to move this store symbol, since we're using it here, above all of these sign-in methods, just to show that it's going to be used later. All right. What do we have problems with now? Let's see. Provide is not used. Very good. Now, we created this auth store, and we're going to actually return it inside of the object returned from create auth store. We're also going to return an install method, which receives the app. And remember, this is how we create a plugin. And this app, or top level app, has a provide method on it. So we're actually going to, when we use this auth store, which we'll see shortly, we're going to provide on the store symbol, which we just put here, the auth store, which is in this function. Now, before we actually use this auth store as a plugin, let's update our useAuth composable. So remember that here in the watch effect that we're getting the store's current user and the onAuth root, but this does not exist anymore, or we do not want to use this anymore in our useAuth function. So we're actually going to not pass any config to useAuth. We're going to get rid of this line, and we're going to access our onAuth root from the store now, which we just set up in that create store. So this will be store.onAuth root, and this will be store.requireAuth root. Very good. Let's save this. And now we should be able to use this plugin in our main.js. So let's go ahead and maybe just beneath the app, import that create auth store function we just created that you can see has all the fields here. Very nice. And then we'll create an auth store beneath the imports. And we could do this in a different file, kind of like we did for the router, but it's very short, so I'll just put it in main.js. And remember, this auth store has the install function, so we can now .use auth store. And now when we put this in the .use, just to review, the install function here will get called, or install field, the function on the install field, and then that will provide our auth store globally to our application. I hope I've said that enough. There are only a couple of small things we need to fix. That is in the auth component and the details component. We were using auth here with the onAuth root, but we now moved this onAuth root to the main configuration, the create auth store. So now useAuth will just be empty, and we'll do the same thing inside of details. So let's kind of just make sure now that our app was working similarly to how it was before. So let's go to the app here, and let's try to reload. Maybe we'll just delete these tokens and start from scratch. And we have an error that our store does not export provide auth. All right, so that was actually inside of the app.vue where we were trying to provide the auth, but we just deleted that. We're now providing the auth, remember, in main.js. So let's try saving this and hope it works. So after refreshing the page, we get to authenticate. We can see that we have no tokens in local storage, so let's just sign in. And we're pushed to the home page and we see our tokens. Very good. It's working as it was before with the refactor. Now, the next thing I want to do is go back to our auth store and add a method to initialize the state from these tokens. So we have this valid user, but if we reload the application, this is a single page application. So we don't have any store data because our initial store basically just has a current user of null. But we want to initialize this current user from the tokens when the app mounts. To do that, we're going to create an initialize user method here inside of auth.js. But to make this a little easier, I want to add a new method in our util index.js file. And down at the bottom, we have a method to store tokens. Let's just add yet another one to get tokens, meaning to get these two tokens. And then one more refactor that I did is I want to maybe store these in constants. And probably I should change the name to not lowercase ID token. It should probably be like all caps, but I'm just going to keep it like I did. And this will be malcorp ID as a string. And I don't know why I didn't put the strings there. That was silly. And then we're going to make a const called refresh token key equal to, and I did it again. I don't know why I don't want to copy the quotes. And so now we will have methods to store both tokens and to get them both, and we'll return it as sort of a tuple, but in the array form. And then I need to update these to use those constants. Again, I should probably put these capitalized with underscores as is custom, but I kind of have this in my notes already, so we're going to go with this. And this will just help us in the initUser method. So we'll go back to auth.js, and just below sign in and sign up, let's add this new method, and it's going to be pretty big, but fear not, I will explain it. All right, I've copied in the code, and let's go to the top. First of all, we need to import this get tokens that we just created, and that is in this util. Very good. And we're not using this yet, but what we'll do is we're going to set our loading state to true and clear out our errors. And then we're going to get the tokens from local storage with that method we just created. Next, we're going to get the payload on the tokens, meaning the actual JSON when we've parsed the token of both the ID and refresh token. Now it's important to remember when we created this get token payload function, if we go in here, we're actually decoding the token and we're checking that the token is valid. And that's what we're doing here by getting the token claims expiration date. And so if the token isn't valid, we're going to return null. And that's just important for our application logic to know that, we may have an ID token here in the browser, but if it's invalid, we're still going to get null when we call this get token payload. All right, so if this ID tokens claims is parsed, we're going to set our state's ID token to the ID token because we've parsed it. We know that it's still valid, and the ID token stores the raw token. And the user, however, is stored on the ID token custom claims user field. So we can also set our current user from the claims. Then no matter what happens, we're going to turn off loading, meaning setting our loading state to false. Then in the background, we're going to silently refresh our tokens by reaching out to our API. If we don't have any refresh token claims though, that means that we were not able to find a refresh token here or __ malcorp rf in our browser. So we'll just return. And if the user had an ID token, then we can let them use that for the next 15 minutes or whenever it expires. But if there is a valid refresh token, so if this is true, we haven't returned, then we're going to reach out to our account tokens API. And that's sort of what we went over in this earlier diagram. If we scroll in, this whole process here. And so we're going to do a post, and in the data, we're going to send the actual refresh token, not the claims, but the JSON web token. Now, if we get an error, we don't want that to affect our application because at this point, we've already had a valid ID token, but we do want to maybe log that there was an error to the console, but then we want to return and do nothing else. If we do get data, we'll extract the tokens field from it and then store tokens, meaning the ID token and the refresh token, using the utility function store tokens, which is pretty simple. It's just using local storage to set these items. Then finally, we're going to actually update our ID token claims or get the updated ones from this refreshed ID token. And then we're going to update our user and we're going to update our ID token. And so this sort of happens in the background. Now we're not using this because I commented out this is initialize user inside of our store. So if we scroll down to that create auth store, where we define an auth store, I will uncomment initialize user. So now this function will be available if the user uses the useAuth composable, because remember, this returns the store. So let's save. And now we're going to use this initialize user. I keep forgetting if I call it initialize user or initialize auth, but it's called initialize user. But let's use this in our app.vue. So the first thing I want to do is import the use auth. And then in the setup function, we will import, or we will extract from use auth the initialize user field and actually the is loading field. And what we'll do is we'll import from vue the on mounted hook. And so this would be similar to adding like a mounted field in the options API or normal Vue 2. But we can add this on mounted inside of our setup function. And this takes a function, and inside of this, we'll just call that initialize user. And so that will call and run this initialization, of getting the tokens and sending to our tokens endpoint. Now we could do something fancier, like create a listener that looks in our local storage at some interval or after 15 minutes to get a fresh token. But I wanted to keep things simple and just get everything fresh when we load the application. Now I also loaded this is loading state, which we will return from the setup to make accessible inside of our template here. And what I want to do is show a loader in the case that the auth state is still initializing. And then I want to not show our router view in that case. So it's just kind of a way of blocking all of our routes while the auth state is being updated. And we can do that by importing the loader that we created. I don't remember if it was 1 or 2 tutorials ago. So let's import a loader. Let's add that to the components. Loader, and add a comma here. And then this is not being used, so let's add the loader. Now I want to get rid of this, the app component title here. I want to add just a div with a little bit of padding, or margin. And let's do it like this. And I also want to put the router view inside of there. And actually, I already copied a router view, so I don't need this, sorry. And so what we're going to do is show a loader with a height of 512. If the is loading state is true, we're going to animate it with Tailwind, and we're going to set it to a blue color, and then we're going to put it at margin auto so that it is centered. Otherwise, if we are not loading, go ahead and show the router view, which will be either the authenticate page or this auth component to log in, or the details page where we'll eventually update user details. So let's save this. And I think that will be it. So let's go here. Let's now maybe delete the ID token just for kicks. And then let's reload the application and see if we get a new ID and refresh token. So this current refresh token ends in HEM. And then we don't have an ID token because I just deleted it. So let's try to refresh this page. And I've clearly forgot something. So let's figure out what this is. So I think the problem is I was just messing around with this. I somehow am storing the key refresh token key instead of the variable. So I think you guys might have seen this earlier and screamed at me. But if we go to util index, I think we're going to see a problem here. And yes, that is because this key should be set as malcorp RF. Although I don't know that this is still the problem. So let's see. Let's clear everything out and let's refresh this page and sign in and then see if everything's working. All right, so let's sign in with our trusted Bob at bob.com with his real high-tech password. And you saw that little loader briefly. Great. So now let's try just refreshing the page with both these tokens. And right now our ID token ends in ILW. So let's see if we refresh if we get a new one. So we load the page. It's good. We did not get pushed to the auth route, so something got loaded. And what does this end with? All right, it now ends in 3SW, so we have a different ID token. Let's now try deleting the ID token. And then let's try to refresh the page with just this RF. And so I can't expire the ID token. I have to wait 15 minutes or go to the app and change things. So I just deleted it in this case. It's not a full test, but it should work. So let's see if we can still get in. Excellent. Now I need to figure out why it flashed there. That was kind of a problem. It should have showed the loading spinner. Now let's see what happens if we delete the refresh token, but we still have a valid ID token. And so in this case, we should be authenticated to use the app. Good. And then if I delete both of these, now hopefully if I run this, we should be forced to our login page. Excellent. So I'm sure there's some edge cases I'm missing, but I hope you really enjoyed that tutorial and you learned something with me about using composition API hooks, about creating plugins, and I thought it was a lot of fun. So I think we have our auth or authentication and authorization in place. So next time we will get working on our details.vue component, which will allow us to update our user's image and details. That's probably going to be a little bit tedious. Let's be honest. It's kind of hard to crop an image and then load that in a component. So we're going to be doing quite a bit of UI work. So get ready, and I can't wait to see you again. Hasta pronto.